Hello and welcome to the Icons of Music with me, Norman J. We feature an artist, maybe from America, maybe from the UK, and give you the background to the artist, play their songs, and play music from associated artists. So, stick with me and listen to the Icons of Music. Icons of Music. Hi and welcome. This week our Icons of Music is a little bit different because we're going to do a feature on the very famous Cavern Club in Liverpool. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Icons of Music with me, Norman J. A series of great programs about the best people in music, the icons. The Cavern Club opened its doors originally in 1957 as a jazz club, and after that the following 10 years were just an explosion of music, and well, it was a great time. The 60s were fantastic, and it produced the Beatles, and of course it was the time of the Mersey sound. So lots and lots of groups coming out of Liverpool. It was a guy called Alan Sintner who opened the Cavern Club, having been inspired by the Jazz District in Paris, where there were a number of cellar clubs. Sintner returned to Liverpool and strove to open a club similar to the Le Caveau de la Huchette in the jazz area of Paris. He eventually found a fruit warehouse where people were leasing the cellar. Before this, it was an air raid shelter in the Second World War, and eventually the club was opened on the 16th of January 1957, and the first act to perform there were the Mersey Sippy Jazz Band. A commercial artist called Tony Booth created the poster artwork for the opening night, and that poster became iconic because it was the original poster that introduced the Beatles. Well, what started as a jazz club eventually became a hangout for skiffle groups of the area. Skiffle was a crossover between rockabilly and rock and roll, and it was a period of music in the 60s or late 50s that was very interesting, because people would put together groups with the smallest amount of gear, possibly a guitar, a washboard, and a bass drum that would be made out of a tea chest and a piece of string and a broom handle. The Vipers skiffle group that were formed in London were probably one of the most popular groups of their time, along with people like Lonnie Donegan, and in actual fact the first group that John Lennon was in, called the Quarrymen, were actually playing the skiffle. The Vipers skiffle group, as I said, were formed in London in 1956. Very interestingly, though, there are people who were associated with this band that went on to bigger things. Wally Whiten was the original bar manager or coffee manager of the Two Eyes Coffee Bar. Johnny Martin joined the band, along with Gene van der Bosch, who were both talented singers. Gene van der Bosch was replaced by Freddie Lloyd later in 1958. But amongst the people in the band over a period of time was Tony Tolhurst on bass, John Pilgrim on washboards. There was Mike Pratt and Tommy Hicks, later to be known as Tommy Steele, and later George Martin, who became the Beatles recording manager at Parlophone, and went on to produce for many, many acts for many, many years. Later, Tommy Steele joined the group, and also Hank Marvin, yes, Bruce Welch, Tony Meehan, who eventually became the Drifters and then became the Shadows. So we have the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London, and I'd done a feature on the Two Eyes Coffee Bar as well, so watch out for that one. But we had the Two Eyes Coffee Bar starting its life in 1957 with rock and roll and rockabilly and skiffle, and we had the Cavern Club that started its life in 1957 as a jazz club. They were in the north, the Two Eyes was in the south, but there's a lot of associations between the two. The Quarrymen formed by John Lennon, and already you can hear John's voice, even though it's not a very great recording. Anyway, there's a story of how the Quarrymen first got a gig at the Cavern Club. Nigel Wally, who was part of the group, was also a apprentice golf professional at Lee Park Golf Club, and one day he saw Sitner playing golf and asked him if the Quarrymen could play at the Cavern. Mr. Sitner, as you remember, was the owner of the Cavern Club, and although it was a jazz club, it tolerated skiffle. Anyway, the Quarrymen were booked on the 7th of August 1957 to appear between two jazz bands. Before the performance, John Lennon got the guys together and they argued about the set list. After the first song, John got the guys together again on stage and said that we're going to play Don't Be Cruel by Elvis. Rod Davis, one of the members, warned Lennon that the audience would eat you alive, but Lennon ignored this and started playing the song himself, forcing the others to join in. Mr. Sitner pushed his way through the audience and handed Lennon a note which read, "Cut out the bloody rock and roll."
Icons of music. Icons of music.
Sitner sold the club to Ray McFall in 1959. He moved to London, and the first blues and beat club was on the 25th of May 1960, and it featured Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And who was the drummer in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes? No other than Ringo Starr. As we develop the story, you'll find out that the Stones played
Hi there,
at the
all you cave dwellers. This is Bob Willis saying welcome to the best of cellos. We got the hi-fi high and the lights down low, so here we go with the big three show.
The Cavern was a very confined space with very low ceilings. It was, well, it was what it was. It was a cellar. It was lively, it was hot and smelly, and you could always smell Dettol. That was Bob Wooler introducing the Big Three. He became the full-time compere and organiser of the lunchtime sessions at the Cavern Club, and the Beatles played their first session on Thursday the 9th of February 1961. Brian Epstein became involved with the Beatles because somebody wanted one of the records, and Brian and his family had a record business, and somebody went into the shop one day and asked for a Beatles record. He'd never heard of them, so he found out where they were working, went down to the Cavern Club, and the rest is history. In the decade that followed, a wide variety of popular acts worked at the Cavern Club, including the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, the Hollies, the Kinks, Elton John, Black Sabbath, Queen, The Who, John Lee Hooker, and, funny enough, Petula Clark, I should say. And she had a big hit in 1965 called I Know a Place. And I just wonder if it was about the Cavern Club. Scylla started working at the Cavern Club She was on the door. She was taking the coats. She was a checking girl, I suppose. She started then doing a little bit of singing with the Beatles on stage, and this was her first big hit.
I'd like to sing one of the songs that made this all possible. It's called Anyone Who Had a Heart. No, I dream of you. Knowing
Anyone Who Had a Heart was released, as I say, in 1964. It became Cilla's first number one and is still the biggest selling single by a British female artist. Now, just before she started work at the Cavern Club, Cilla Black was a singer in a group called King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. They were a Liverpool band that formed in the late 1950s. They played at the Cavern Club. They also played in Germany with the Beatles and many other of the groups. If you're not as old as I am, and I can tell you that in 2 years I'm going to be 70 years old, which means I've been listening to music since I was about 5 years old. So I've been listening to nearly 100 years of music, because when I started to listen to music, I was listening from the 20s and 30s. But during this period of the 60s, there was a total revolution in music. There was a move from the old school type music. We'd move from jazz into what you can call it, film music, swing music, you know, the Frank Sinatra days, rockabilly, skiffle, and now we were getting rock and roll. And every time you turn the radio on, and I mean this, there was something new coming through, because up to now we didn't have synthesizers. We just had guitar, drums, bass, and that was, well, obviously trumpets and things, but nothing too technical, nothing too electrical at this particular point in time. So there was a lot to come. The Beach Boys were different. They were from America. They were from a different culture, but they'd realised that there was something in harmonies, and that sort of sound developed with the development of electronics as we go through the next decade. In April 1960, Gene Vincent was on tour with Eddie Cochran and the songwriter Sharon Sheeley. They were involved in a high-speed traffic accident in Chippenham, Wiltshire. Vincent broke his ribs and collarbone. Cochran, who was thrown through the vehicle, died a few days later, unfortunately. After the accident, Vincent went back to the United States, but unfortunately his career wasn't going anywhere, so he returned to the UK and actually set up residence here, because the tour that he'd been on earlier was so successful. He then went on to tour in Germany with the rest of the guys from the UK. As I say, it was an explosion of music at that particular time. He was backed by a group called the Wild Angels and performed at the Royal Albert Hall with Bill Haley and Dwayne Eddy. And everybody says that the guy responsible for rock and roll was Bill Haley. The Americans were a big influence on young guys in the UK. We said, you know, the Cavern Club opened its doors as a jazz venue, which was taken over by the guys that were doing skiffle. And we mentioned the Two Eyes. Well, from the Two Eyes we had the first of the rock and roll acts to come from the UK. We had Tommy Steele, we had Adam Faith, Cliff Richard, Marty Wilde, etc. And two guys that became management for these guys, impresarios, agents, whatever you want to call them, Jack Good and Larry Palms. Larry Palms also visited Liverpool and was interested in taking the Beatles on, but unfortunately Brian Epstein got there before him. But he did take on another Liverpool act, and that was Billy Fury. That was Billy Fury, who was discovered in Liverpool, and one of the first gigs he did was the Cavern Club. More on Billy Fury later. Liverpool's Cavern Club is the cradle of British pop music. Impressively, 60 years after its foundation, it survives and thrives as a contemporary music venue. Through 7 eventful decades before, during and after the Beatles, this legendary cellar has seen its share of setbacks, yet has played a role in each genre of music, from 1950s jazz to the 21st century indie rock scene. In the 1950s, the history of the Cavern Club begins on Wednesday, the 16th of January 1957, when the doors opened to this first time famous warehouse in 10 Matthew Street, Liverpool. In the early 1960s, the beat music scene in Liverpool exploded, and the Cavern Club became the most publicised pop music venue in the world.
Icons of Music, a weekly series.
60s Icons, plus specials every Saturday, with Norman J. Icons of Music.